Welcome, everybody. My name is Kevin Bosch. I'm the chair of the Pearson Centre. Welcome to our discussion today on public policy issues involving criminal justice systems response to issues involving women. Some of the discussion you'll hear today contains references and discussions of themes of sexual assault and intimate partner violence, which some individuals may find distressing and re-traumatizing and trigger uncomfortable feelings. Please reach out to your local sexual assault center for assistance or call 911 in the case of an emergency. I'd like to begin today's discussion with a land acknowledgement. The Pearson Centre is located in Ottawa, and we acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, whose connection to this land reaches back through millennia. I'd like to begin this discussion before I hand it over to our wonderful CEO, Pam Damoff, by first thanking our sustaining sponsors at the Pearson Centre. AMAPSIO, CBTU, the Canadian Building Trade Unions, Bruce Power, TikTok Canada, Faskins, and the Sandstone Group. So Pam, over to you, please.
Thanks so much, Kevin. And I want to thank these brilliant women who are joining us today. We have my dear friend Karen Vecchio, former MP and former chair of the Status of Women Committee for, I think it was 8 years, Karen, at least.
Quite some time, yes.
Yeah. Megan Walker, who is currently the VP Justice with the National Council of Women of Canada, but also longtime advocate for women and women's rights. And last but certainly not least, Alexa Barkley, who's the co-founder of Survivor Safety Matters. So ladies, thank you so much for joining us today for this really important conversation. Karen, I'm going to start with you. Take us back to 2022. The Hockey Canada scandal broke, and you were involved with two committees in the House of Commons who called witnesses. And I wonder if you could just share with us what was heard and also the recommendations that came out of that.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. It's so important that we're having a forum like this after. Now, Pam, I don't know if you want me to speak for 1 minute or 20 minutes on this because there is such a vast background on here, really. So, it really started with TSN. Rick Westhead, he broke the story. It was them. It was coming from a fact that a $3.1 million payout from Hockey Canada was being provided to a survivor of violence. And, that's the first time the public really started hearing about this. And it takes me back to thinking of those days in July of 2022, when the Heritage Committee, we called in Hockey Canada to discuss, can you explain to me how Hockey Canada could pay out $3.1 million of money from children's fees? Can you explain this to us? Now, how did Hockey Canada have to come there? As a funding agent, we give a little portion from the government of Canada to Hockey Canada. So we had the right as taxpayers to ask, please explain these things to us. So it's really interesting because I'm in a microscope. If you're looking, I am in a circle of hockey. We live 20 minutes, and I'm looking at Megan because we cheer on the London Knights. We're hockey fans where we know that, there's some great things. But I had minor hockey leagues. I had them calling me saying, what's going on here? So what happened? Hockey Canada called, and it was then we found out that a young woman, her stepfather had called in to advise about this sexual assault that had taken place after the 2018 celebration for winning the gold medal. And from there, we heard from Hockey Canada. How did they respond? What happened? And how their immediate response. And I'm looking at Megan because I'm going, I know how she would feel about this. But what happened in those 48 hours? And it was a young woman who had been sexually violated, and regardless of what you think on this, it was a violation, period. And she was violated. Her stepfather called into the police. They asked for an investigation. Hockey Canada, I'm going to go down the one chute and I'll let others join in. Hockey Canada, at their celebration the next day, found out. They get onto the phone in the middle of the day with lawyers and start doing investigations. But at the end of the day, it comes out to the fact that they paid $3.1 million. And there was really no disciplinary action. No one knew about it. It was fees coming from other people. And, there was not even a slap on the wrist. So this was just a horrible situation that we heard about. and I know we can expand on that. And EM had come forward and shared what was actually happened to her. So that's really important to understand the abuse. But we took it into the Status of Women Committee as well. So Heritage Canada continued looking at Hockey Canada, continued to look at, their funding, how they fund from Sport Canada, how they fund to all of our different national associations. And then in Status of Women, we took a little bit of a different approach, and it was very, very victim and survivor focused. We had people coming from Gymnasts for Change. There was almost over 800 people who had signed a paper informing them that they had been impacted by violence and abuse through their sport. At the time, it was gymnastics that we were seeing. It was triggered by hockey. Then we saw it in gymnastics. And then we could go across the sports, whether it was swimming or diving or lacrosse or athletics. And we were seeing massive issues. So not only were we dealing with the hockey culture that we can talk about here, but we're also seeing this hierarchy and this patriarchy of sports, and it was unbelievable. There are two different reports that came out from the House of Commons. One came out of the Status of Women, and we tabled that about 2 years ago, and another one came out from Heritage Canada. They will both, I believe, read very differently. There had been a request for a national investigation into this, where we would do a national inquiry. That really was not absorbed by the government at the time, or I would say many opposition parties. But it's really changing. How do we change the culture of sport? How do we make it safe for all to join? And how can something like this in Hockey Canada, how can something like this be slipped under the rug at $3.1 million and everybody turned their heads? If it wasn't for TSN, we may not have known. And Rick covered this. I believe Megan may have spoken to Rick as well, but he covered this for TSN. And, unfortunately, it's something that we see in sport. So now, what are we going to do to change it?
Well, thank you. And Karen, sincerely, thank you for your leadership on this issue, because, sorry, if it hadn't been for you and your leadership, you shone a spotlight on an issue that is so important. Because, I mean, you and I have been at the Status of Women Committee, and it's, issues around violence against women and sexual assault go far beyond just sport culture. It's a systemic issue, the way women are treated in the criminal justice system, going all the way back to when Ronna Ambrose had a private member's bill on the education of justice judges around sexual assault, which is still an issue. But sincerely, thank you for your leadership, because you really did make a difference in really shining a spotlight on what happened. And Megan, I'm going to turn to you for just a minute, because you had said to me that those hearings actually provided hope to survivors and advocates. And I'm wondering if you can maybe talk about that, and also how you're feeling now after the decision in London, and what has transpired since then.
So when Karen took on her role, it was very exciting for many women who followed politics, because it was not very often you would see an actual woman who would be doing the lead role on an area like this. And so it was very exciting for women to know that what they said would be considered, and how they said it would be forgiven if they didn't say the right things that typically are said. Whereas with men, we've always found that there's a script that the women are supposed to follow, and if they don't follow that, the outcome is not as favorable. So women were filled with tremendous hope, and also everybody, in Ontario, anyways, knew Karen very well, and so they were comforted by the knowledge that she was going to take this seriously. So that was one area which was sort of a surprise out of it all, because of the amount of enthusiasm for Karen and for what was going on in the hearings. With respect to your other questions, so first of all, we know that the criminal justice system continues to fail women and girls. But we also know that it's not just the justice system, it's every point where women and girls have access can fail them. So it could be at a grocery store, or it could be at a dentist's office, wherever it is. So women continue to be discriminated against, and it's really significant that that continues to happen after all these years of women's advocates dating back like a long time, and everything they've put into this. But it is the reality. Women are considered to be second class citizens in many organizations, and women are not offered the same opportunities as men. Women are not offered, women are not offered jobs to the same degree that men are. In fact, we know that the number of women who are offered jobs is significantly lower than those offered to men. And so we have a lot of work to do. We've always had a lot of work to do. One of the biggest disappointments, I think, in my life has been watching the backwards trend that we are now moving in. So women and girls face even steeper hills to climb to, be recognized in the same way that over the past 40 or 50 years, women were recognized. It's a very sad time for women. But this is definitely a systemic issue that we see everywhere, that women and girls are gathering.
Well, Megan, we're named after Lester B. Pearson, and we were just doing a bit of a write-up on the former prime minister, and that was back in the 60s when he founded the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, to deal with all those issues that you're talking about, including the gender pay gap, and you think about that and how many years have gone by that we're still facing so many of these issues, right? Mm-hmm. Alexa, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about survivors of sexual violence and intimate partner violence. In the judicial system and in society in general, we tend to look for the perfect victim. We don't look for the perfect perpetrator, but we do expect the victim to be perfect. And I've been reading a book that talked about the various responses to trauma. I think everybody sort of knows the fight or flight response. That's sort of a natural thing that most of us understand. But it also talked about the freeze response, which the easiest analogy would be a deer caught in the headlights. Why doesn't that deer run away to prevent itself from being hit? It doesn't. It freezes, which is a common response to trauma. And then the other one, which was a term I hadn't heard before, was fawning. And that's where the victim does things to try and please the abuser in order to lessen the impact on themselves. So, for example, someone who's in an abusive relationship and people say, why did you stay, or why did you do this? And it's in order to, in their mind, lessen the impact on themselves or their children. I wonder if you could maybe talk about how the lack of knowledge and recognition of these trauma responses is impacting women in the criminal justice system.
Definitely. So I attended the first day of the Hockey Canada trial and then the verdict. And what stuck out to me in the testimony of PM was a lot of things that you're talking about: the freeze impulse, the fawn impulse, and it was interesting to see how the judge completely didn't understand that. Unfortunately, because of the Hogard case, the courts are moving away from including trauma specialists, but trauma.
So maybe, people may not know what that case is, Alexa.
Sure. Yeah. So Jacob Hogart, a musician, recently had a big sexual assault case against him. He ended up appealing, and at the appeals level, the judge had said that the trauma specialist that was included in the case should not have been included. But in that scenario, it was managed effectively, and so it wasn't enough to create a successful appeal. But certainly, it put the message out there into society that we will not be including trauma specialists in the court process. And I know the judge in EM's case pointed to that as well. Seemed to think trauma was a common sense thing, easy to understand. It's mind-boggling, and that experts were not required.
So I mean, judges don't get training in trauma response. It's not being brought into the trial. So, this has an impact not just in a trial like EM's, but I'm thinking even of family courts, where there's issues around custody and having a trauma-informed approach to the criminal justice system. It's why we see a disproportionate number of Indigenous women. The fastest growing prison population in Canada is because of their response to trauma that they've experienced. So, um, and please, if Megan or Karen, you want to jump in here, please feel free. But how do you deal with something like that, where it has been decided that you can't bring in trauma specialists, and yet it's at the core of the entire in the core of the entire trial?
Well, and I think it's only a piece of the problem. So definitely we need trauma experts to come in, but truly the whole system is tilted in favor of the accused. And this is just another way that, again, there's that disproportionality. So I truly think we restructure the whole thing, make the whole process trauma informed in order to get to more of a truth-seeking function, which we definitely are not achieving currently.
So what do we need to be looking at? And sorry, Karen, go ahead.
I was going to just add in, and it's interesting because you and I know, Pam, that we tried to do trauma-informed questioning because in the House of Commons, we were having people that had come in and been so violated, whether it's new refugees to Canada, whatever it may be. And we as politicians were not asking properly informed questions, and all we're doing is re-victimizing the person. To me, that's common sense, is not re-victimizing a person who is with us today and surviving what they've got, the trauma that they've gone through. So it's absolutely opposite on what I think we should be doing. I never understood privilege till I became a member of Parliament, and I understood that privilege is not about money. It is about the safety of one's soul. It's about, for me, knowing that I had gone to bed every night safe in my own bed. I never had those experiences that young women had sometimes within their own family. So for someone to not think that people need to be trauma informed is extraordinarily privileged of them. Extraordinary. And I'm not coming as a rich white woman. I'm coming as just like a middle-class mom who says, let's be real here.
And I think it's really important that we understand the relationship with the judiciary. So it's very clear that many judges do not have the training necessary to do the job. But we also are robbed of the opportunity to intervene with that or interfere or ask questions because they stand on their own. The judges stand on their own. The judiciary is not accountable to any person or any individual. In fact, I don't think they're really accountable to anybody. And we've always maintained that if we want to have a good justice system, we need to have fully trained and involved judges. And an example of why that's important is really, if I could use the Hockey Canada situation for a moment, the legislation we have, I think, is good and solid legislation around consent. But if the judges don't know what they're doing, and if the judges don't know what that even means, we can't expect them to make a good decision based on good legislation. And so, the idea that we can't even provide training, mandatory training to judges when they have so much responsibility and power is really a difficult concept to grasp. And it's wrong. And, I remember when, Jennifer Kagan went through the situation with Kira, and she said at the end of the day, yes, this is wonderful. And it is wonderful what she accomplished. But it also failed in that it didn't include training for judges. And how are we ever going to move forward on these issues that are so important, particularly in the lives of women and girls, if those who have the power to make the difference are not willing to listen and learn another way? And that is a very serious issue, and it needs to be addressed.
Well, and the training, and Alexa, maybe I'll turn to you for this, but the training needs to expand not just beyond just judges, but you're looking at Crown prosecutors, the
Yeah.
police service. I mean, Karen will remember when we ended up being on the cover of the Globe and Mail for a Status of Women report. I still have the article because the Globe had done an article on unfounded cases across the country, which were ridiculously high in police services. In fact, where I am in Halton had one of the highest levels of unfounded cases. And we know that the number of women who actually come forward in the first place is incredibly low. And the ones who do come forward are being met with a system where the training of whether at every point in the judicial system that they come in contact with is sorely lacking.
Mm-hmm.
Alexa, maybe you could just add to that a little bit, and how, what do we need to be looking at to fix this?
So I'm a survivor who's gone through the court system twice for sexual assault, and I also, through End Violence Everywhere, I work with survivors of sexual violence. So I've had a fairly good look at the justice system and how it treats survivors, and it's abysmal, quite frankly. Like you say, from the beginning right through to many survivors know that and will avoid, hence the low reporting rates. But there are survivors who need justice as part of their healing. Many survivors are also very worried about what their perpetrator will do to other people. And so they are entering the system sort of knowingly putting themselves in harm's way to try to protect the general public. What they are facing when they do decide to enter that system is overwhelming. There's a lack of information, lack of sort of a trauma-informed around you. You're very much, because you're only a witness, you're very much set off to the side. You don't get legal representation, with the exception of the Section 276, 278 piece. You don't get information. You don't have anybody to talk to, really. You can talk to the Crown, but only minimally. It's just very different from the experience of the who gets legal counsel throughout, gets information throughout. He doesn't have to testify, you do. There's a bunch of things that are really off balance that really end up harming survivors.
And so many people think that the Crown is there to represent them, and the Crown is actually there to represent the Crown, and the defense is there to represent the accused, and therefore there is actually no one who is representing the survivor of the assault, right?
Right. Well, and there's also, so there's a victim witness assistance program, but it's severely underfunded, and often they're providing incorrect information. So we've had some survivors, actually, including myself, that were harmed when incorrect information was passed to them by victim witness. So even the supports that are in place are sort of tenuous and hard.
And sporadic across the country too, right? Depending on where you live, there may be more or less support for you. I mean, Megan, you've been dealing with this for a long time, not just the EM case, but issues with women who've come forward, right?
Mm-hmm. So women it's, as has been stated, it's very difficult for women to come forward to anybody to report, including police, but also including anybody, because, they could go to a parent who then shames them, or my child wouldn't do that, or whatever it is. These things happen. And it's because we live in a society still where, women are supposed to dress a certain way and behave a certain way. And so if they go off the norm, it's their fault. As I think back on so many cases that I was involved with, I think of a consistency around failure. And, it's it's easy, to have that judge, to have the Crown Attorney walk through the glass doors in London, for instance, into this wide space, calling out in front of everybody, Megan, is there a Megan in here? And then the person comes forward, and as she is walking with the Crown into the courtroom, he's taking notes. Okay, now tell me that again. Okay, yeah. He hasn't even read the file. So how can we even expect a basic part of justice in this world we live in when we don't have crowns or other people that even have the resources available to themselves to examine and look into the cases? And then also, I'll just address something really quickly about what upset me about that trial as well recently, which is that you don't have to be mean-spirited to people. You can make a decision, a sound decision, but when you start making it personal and you transfer to a state of meanness, you've gone over the top. And in fact, in all of my years of, court accompanied work or whatever it was, I have never seen a judge with such contempt for a victim as I saw in the Hockey Canada case. And it was absolutely horrific, and I found it very disturbing. And I think there needs to be some accountability for that behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I know, Alexa, you had said your phone was, you were there, I know, and as were a number of people at every day at the courthouse. I think you were there too, Megan.
No.
Oh, you weren't. Okay.
I had a conflict of interest, so I couldn't go.
Okay, but
Yeah.
I know you said your phone just exploded, as did mine, and I was texting Karen actually before the end of the decision was actually read, because it started out saying that she wasn't credible, and I actually found that really disturbing, that the survivor of the sexual assault has to be credible, but a witness who came as not, he wasn't charged, but he was someone who didn't, he was testifying for the Crown. He said he didn't remember sending a text, he didn't remember what happened. And all of this happened 7 years ago. And yet the victim was expected to remember every single minute detail exactly. And if she didn't, she wasn't credible. And yet someone else who doesn't remember it, the young man who testified, somehow that was okay. And I found that really disturbing. And sadly, that's not it just plays into so many of the rape myths that are out there.
Pam, I had gone and I was speaking to my parents after this decision because I've been asked a lot of questions, and I had unfortunately predicted this outcome because I had said, I saw the deck being stacked against her. You just did. And you sit there going, I know the truth, but I see what has been done. And the fact, I always go back and, it's like the fact that these young men, that this was okay. Holy shnikes. This is where we have our, that term, right? This is where we have our problems. When did a woman become an object? And so we go back to the judicial system, and then I look at how this bias is all in us to think that this is okay, whether she's wearing a crop top or not. As Megan has talked about, the way that she presents herself and what's right and wrong and the norm. Oh my gosh, I would hate to think that we're all so different. And the fact is, the judicial system did in this case destroy this young woman by allowing her to be so, you need to be scrutinized, but destroyed this for her rest of her life, the thing that she will now internally feel, right?
Well, and the NHL has said that they're not going to allow these players to play in the NHL. I know the Players Association has pushed back on that, but Alexa, you and I were talking about this yesterday. Not guilty does not mean that, most contracts have a morality clause. Mm-hmm. And is this the way that you want your team represented in this kind of behavior, right? What are your thoughts on the NHL and their decision there? Was that the right decision that they made?
I think it was, but I'm hesitant to give Gary Bettman too much credit because I think, quite frankly, it's more of a liability issue for them. I mean, we saw Hockey Canada had to make this huge payout to EM. If these guys were to continue with this behavior in the future, there would be financial risk for the NHL. So Definitely glad it happened, but I think the reason it happened is not altruistic.
I also think we need to focus for a second on what that actually meant when they said, "Well, you're not going to be able to play." It's not a long-term thing. They're
It's a
examining.
temporary.
They're going to be looking at that and deciding, well, are we going to let them play or not? And so that's a problem. You are either in this to show support for women, or you're not. But you can't have it both ways. And the other thing that really bothered me about it was that, you don't have to have a contract. It's basic common sense that you should not behave in certain ways. And for a group of young men to think they can behave, even when they're found, not guilty, to behave in that way is very extraordinary. You would hope somebody would say to them, okay, you're not guilty, but you got a lot of work to do on this, because what you have done here is very damaging to a lot of people.
And building off that, Megan, that's exactly what I think the NHLPA has done. And, many of the players, not that I know very many personally, but many of the players would say, how can you go after us? It was that moral code that they broke. And I think that's where they're saying that by the NHLPA making a statement that they're fighting on their behalf, they're saying what these young men did was okay. I'm sorry, it is not okay. So I think they better do a checkup. During that period of time, it was really difficult because, OHL, everybody started scrutinizing everything. So those OHL teams and all of the junior A teams were looked at very closely across Canada. I know I did a deep dive into what was happening in our own local hockey system to make sure that, there's a lady, Wendy Glover, that I know that is teaching and trying to do those types of things. What are we doing? Because this team of athletes, because we know that we also in hockey, I think everybody cheered in 2010 when we won the gold medal in the Olympics. We have this hockey culture about us. So that doesn't mean that these young hockey players are not accountable to the law like everybody else. So it's great to cheer them on, but they still should be going by the same laws as every other person in our country.
Well, and it's not just hockey.
Exactly.
You see in football where players are suspended because they're subject to domestic violence charges or convictions, and a little bit of time goes by. Even players who have had multiple charges against them, and they're still allowed to play because they win football games. And so it comes down to an attitude of, well, they win, and we'll turn a blind eye to the way that they treat women. It tends to be pervasive, quite honestly, in sport.
There was recently this is maybe a year ago or 2 years ago now, but it's fairly recent. One of the football players was charged with rape and convicted, and because he was an all-star player, they allowed him to stay in the game. And you see, this is the problem. We elevate certain people in society. And when we elevate them, we say, you are the perfect person, you can do no wrong, and we're going to get as much value out of you as we can. And we don't care who that hurts. And that's something that really needs to change.
I was reading recently that the Department of Women and Gender Equality could be facing an 81% budget reduction. Now, I recognize there hasn't been a federal budget, and so the department has to do a plan based on the money that's available. But I think I'd really like to hear what impact any reduction, let alone an 81% reduction, will have on women, gender diverse people in Canada, and the grassroots organizations who are already underfunded, who support survivors. So Karen, maybe I'll start with you and then we'll go around.
Well, I think there's always, in any government, I don't want to put on a political hat, but in any government, there's some fat. But I look at the fat that might be in wage, and I don't see a lot of fat. I see a lot of programs that are going to those not-for-profits that are helping with understanding the criminal code, making sure that we're working against human trafficking where we're knowing numbers are going up, or sexual assaults. What are we doing? To me, this must be a priority. We can look at it that, to me, gender and women equality is a priority, because I didn't realize it. And this, I always say, I didn't realize it until I became an MP, how the world just isn't as fair as I thought it was. And, I see those opportunities that many young women don't have. When we talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, if it wasn't wage working against that issue, who is going to be working on that issue? And I think that's the lot of thing is there's a lot in wage, we pick up the hard stuff. And I look, the hard stuff is what those programs are being funded for. It's those things that are missing or need to fill in those gaps. So it's the social side of things that I think is really, really important. So I'm very concerned, especially for our not-for-profit organizations that are providing first line services.
Megan, how about you? And then we'll go over to you, Alexa.
Well, I just wrote a column about this actually, which will come out later today, I think. But when the Prime Minister was elected, he actually started to change the way business was being done. And so one of the things he did at that time was reduced to 24 ministers, which means you're going to have a huge, effect all the way down the line. Excuse me. But he also, when we as women complained about it and asked for permanent action to be taken to avoid that, we were told, well, there was somebody who, they pretty much gutted it already, and Mr. Carney decided that he was going to have a new ministry instead, which had something to do with, I can't even remember, but it was a man that he appointed to take over on a short-term basis, status of women. Mm-hmm. And I was just appalled. Like, it was the first time ever a man had been appointed to run the status of women, program. It was so telling to me that it doesn't matter that he's a man to Carney. It matters only that he's got somebody there for the short term to appease the people that are upset with him. Anyway, eventually that sort of did change, but now what's happening is that now what is happening is that we're under siege again. So we're under threat because of this potential increase, and how are we going to cope if we have restrictions of that nature, on us, and we won't cope. That's the reality. We won't cope, and women will be left once again invisible, because when women are ignored like that, or a man comes in, it makes women invisible, and that is what's going to continue to happen. And honestly, I really wish I could sort out in my mind what he's thinking of doing with all of this. Like, why? Status of Women is so successful. It was the best committee. There was so much engagement. And then just to turn it off on a whim, it seems, is really short-sighted, for one thing, but it's also very disrespectful to women and girls.
Alexa, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think for me, the timing of that announcement was extremely problematic for the survivor community that were reeling already from the Hockey Canada verdict. It was a kick in the teeth to hear of that level of defunding. I'm on the board for a sexual assault center, and so I get to see that on the ground work that's taking place and how critical that is for survivors. I also know the struggle for funding. It's a big part of what we do as an organization. And so that all of that would be put at risk, especially during a time where violence against women is actually increasing, and against the LGBTQ community as well, to have that funding backed off. I'm actually, I feel a bit duped. I supported Carney, and then to have this happen is shocking, quite frankly. And I sort of feel like we're moving into fight mode. We're going to push back.
Well, and the Pearson Centre just did an op-ed on the impact on women of an economic downturn, and we know that violence goes up. We know that, and it has been going up since the pandemic. You're seeing unbelievable rates of increase in gender-based violence, in femicides. And we also know that women are the first ones that are losing their jobs. So, yes, it's important to look at what's happening in the steel and auto industry, and yes, we need to support those important Canadian industries, but we also need to look at what's happening to women. And I think of women entrepreneurs who are going to be impacted by tariffs to send their stuff into the U.S. and are they going to have to close down? There's a huge impact, and we just put something out because it's not being discussed. And with an 81% cut, if that was to happen, those organizations are not going to be able to support those women. Karen?
I totally agree. And I'm even from the word femicide. Megan taught me that word femicide for years ago. But how long did it take for the government of Canada, for members of parliament to actually absorb that word and start using it for what it really meant? It took us probably a decade from when Megan told me to the time I actually started hearing it in the House of Commons. So I find that on the ground is so far ahead of what's happening. But you talk about all of these impacts to women entrepreneurs, all of those things. But we have to go back to where we started. The fact is, we can't go back there. We've seen it. We've done it. We've got to keep on pushing back. I'm going to sit there and say, with Carney, I'm hoping it's the fact that he is still so new to politics that he doesn't understand that other side of politics, because I think a lot of times it's extremely important to look at fiscal. It is like, speaking as a person, I think the fiscal responsibility allows the social programs, and that's really, really important. And I think he understands that part of things, but he needs to start turning on that other side of the brain that has that empathy and everything else that goes with it. I think that's really, really important. So I think we've got a long way to continue to go. But I look at even things like femicide, the fact that it took us a long time, but we're learning slowly. And that's why we can't stop the fight.
Yeah. And I agree with that, Karen. The thing about femicide is, still we can't get it legislated. Everybody who's involved with women's issues is saying it needs to be legislated, define and legislate it so that we can prevent the number of femicides occurring in our country. But we're still fighting it. For some reason, there's a lack of interest in doing that. And the other thing I want to say about violence against women and girls specifically is that it's not just that there are more women being violated. It's the level of violence committed against them is absolutely horrific. And, I've spoken to so many, like in trafficking and things where we talk about this with women who have experienced violence, and they say, it's so bad I don't even remember my name some days. It's just like this complete stoppage in their lives. And I'm not going to tell you stories today, but I am going to tell you that the work I started doing years ago and the work that I left when I retired many years later was so different with respect to the level of trauma our staff would experience. Because it was just incredible to listen to these women and the courage and strength they had to come forward for help, while at the same time just fighting demons every single day.
So maybe we can end this on a note that, like, people who are listening in or watching, what can we do to support survivors like EM and Alexa to see change in Canadian society, and what do we need our governments to do in order to see that change? We can complain about it, but what do we want to see happen, and how can we encourage? Sometimes people will say, well, it's too big a problem, there's nothing I can do, or that's somebody else's problem, they'll deal with it. So if anybody is tuning into this conversation, we could probably talk about this issue for half an hour, but what are some of the things that people can do? Maybe I'll start with you, Karen, and then go to you, Alexa, and we'll end with you, Megan.
We did a really incredible study, and it was looking at the violations of violation of Indigenous women in the resource sector. And we had a man, I believe, from Saskatchewan, who really talked, and it wasn't the Changing Ways programs, but it was really about how do you teach a young man and it comes down to the age of like 1 or less, that we are equal, that a young girl and a young man, or young boy and a young girl, that all kids are equal in the sandbox. And that really never should change. And, we talk a lot about that, but it's how do we break that cycle of violence? And it's intergenerational. And what does the government have to do with it? Sometimes it's the criminal justice system to make sure violators are actually put behind bars. Sometimes it's programs to make sure that women have a fresh start through economic empowerment for them and their children. It's a variety of different things, but I think it's for me, it's collaboration with not-for-profits and the government to make sure that we have systems that work, that are benefiting the victims.
Alexa, I know you're busy working, and you know what? I'd like to give you the opportunity to talk about this too. One of the issues you're concerned about is a particular section of the criminal code, and maybe you can talk about the work that the ombudsperson for the victims of crime is doing as well.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm working on section 278.1, which is the part of the criminal code that allows or manages the process on bringing personal records into the court process. So as of right now, although there is a process that is meant to protect us, your therapy records can be brought in to court and then used by the defense to attack you. Your personal journals, same thing. So any sources of support, if you went to a sexual assault center, could be brought into court and used against you. And so we want to ensure that survivors have access to all of the support that they need as they go through what is an inherently stressful process with the criminal justice system. And so we've put forward a recommendation on how the criminal code can be changed. Now, the federal ombudsman for victims of crime is doing a systemic review, which will corroborate our position that this is in fact a problem, as well as touching on many other issues within the criminal justice system. And that is set to come out this fall. And I am hopeful that justice will grab onto that information and use that to decide what they're going to do as far as changing legislation. But they will have data that proves that what we are saying is correct and that the system needs to change.
And Megan, how about you?
So we can do a lot of things. First and foremost, I want to always remind people to support survivors and victims. We all have a role to play in ensuring that they have a safe place to go and can continue to move on in their life's journey. I also want to, I think it's important that the government stop the threats of closure of certain, ministries, as an example, because it's very debilitating for those of us doing this work. Femicide, of course, should be legislated. I'm not sure why it hasn't been, but it should be. That would be huge. I mean, we are losing so many women every single year. And in Canada, this glorious country of ours, a woman is killed every 36 hours in this country. It's appalling. I'd also like to say that I would support funding for training, and not for training professionals, but for ensuring that frontline workers have the skills they need to continue to provide the valuable services that they are providing. And of course, I support a woman-centered view of the world. And so I would like to see that really given some prevalence, because right now, aside from women's advocates, we don't hear a lot about that. And I guess in my last point, I would say that we hear a lot about equality. And I have made a decision. I made this decision quite a while ago that I'm no longer looking to equality as the be all and end all. I do not want to be aligned or supported by in any way those that oppress women and girls. And equality is just, I don't want that. I want more. And I think women deserve more. And so I will always come down on the side of supporting women in being free from oppression.
Well, and I think anybody who, as Canadians can advocate with all levels of government. It's not just the federal government that needs to be involved. It's all the way down to municipal governments who fund police services and ensuring that police services are trained and there's representation from grassroots organizations being involved with police services all the way up to the federal government and legislation. And as a former MP, and I know Karen will agree with me on this, that outreach from my constituents, we do listen, and we may not be able to do everything that you'd like, but reaching out to elected representatives and sharing your opinions in a respectful way to show that these issues are important to us. Sometimes they're a minority that have a really loud voice that tends to get heard, and it's important that everyone be involved in these things. So I want to thank all three of you for being here and sharing your perspective, but more importantly, for the important work that you do every single day. You make our country better because you're doing what you're doing. Kevin, I'll turn it over to you just to close us off.
Yeah, well, I want to echo what you said there, Pam, and thank our panelists for all the work they're doing. And thank you, Pam, for leading this very timely, very informative, and very important discussion that everyone in the public policy ecosystem needs to engage in. So thank you all very much for participating today. I want to thank our sustaining sponsors, Mapsio, CBTU, Bruce Power, TikTok Canada, Baskins, and Sandstone Group. And thank you everyone for taking the time to listen and join the discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.